Today's video is going to cover adding followers to a user account using Devise, and then adding a following counter as well to show how many people someone is following. You could then use these same collections of objects to list out the people someone's following or their followers. We're going to be pushing these updates to the user that follows someone, but we're not going to be pushing the updates out to everyone, because if you have 1 million people following someone and that causes everyone's page to update 1 million times a second, that can cause some performance issues. So just as a note, it's only going to be updating in real time for the person that actually followed the user. But we're going to start by adding Devise to this application. So I'm going to full screen this, hit Control+ a couple times. And I'm just going to say bundle add Devise, which will add the Devise gem. If you haven't installed it yet, you'll have to go through the installation where it downloads it, but I already have it downloaded, so we're good. Then I'm going to say Rails G Devise :install to install Devise, which will give us some steps that we can follow. You're of course free to follow these, but I'm not good at following directions. So instead, I'm just going to type Rails G Devise user to create a user account. Once that's done, we're then going to create our relationships model, which is what we're going to use for the following setup. So we'll just say Rails G model. We'll call it a relationship, and we'll give each relationship a follower underscore ID of type integer and a followee underscore ID :integer. And the follower is of course the person who follows a user. The followee is the person that user is following. And we'll rename these in the actual model's relationship, but this is just sort of how we're storing it in the database. So once that's done, we can go ahead and run a Rails DB :migrate command to migrate the database. And we can run a Rails S command to start the server, because we're pretty much done here. There is one thing that I forgot to do. I'm going to full screen this with F11. Now that we're full screen, we can come over to config initializers and devise.rb, and then we're going to do a Control F for navigational formats. And the reason we're doing this is you'll run into issues with Devise doing when you're trying to sign up a new user, unless you do a turbo underscore stream for the navigational formats. And once you have this, you can now sign up users without needing to refresh afterwards because of the annoying Devise error. So that's the first thing we need to take a look at. The next thing we're going to look at is the routes. So what I want to do is just create a home page and create a controller for the users, because we're going to have like a user profile page. So I'm actually going to stop the server, hit F11, and then Control L to clear the console. I'm going to type Rails G controller. We'll say this is for the page's home, just to give us a home page. And then we want another controller that we're going to use for the user's profiles. So for this, we'll type Rails G controller. We'll say this is for a profile controller, and by default, we'll just give it a show action. Now, the reason why I'm not calling this the user controller is because if you have a user path or a user's path, you can sometimes run into overlaps with Devise where it doesn't work 100% of the time just because of how the routes work out. If you were to go that way, I would say use a user singular controller, because users is going to cause a whole bunch of issues with Devise. But for this one, we're just going to use profile, and then we'll just rename it later. So that works. Now let's type Rails S to start the server again, and then let's come over here and make sure that our application is working. Looks like it is. Okay, so now we can come into the routes file, and in here, we're basically going to replace this get pages home with a call for a route. So this is going to be the root of our application or the home page. So if we save that, hit F5, it'll take us back to the home page. So that looks good. The next thing I want to do, instead of doing a get for the profile, I'm just going to do something where you can go to /p/the user ID. So we're just going to say get p/:ID, which is going to be our ID parameter. And then we're going to have this go to the profile controller and the show action, which is what we generated earlier. So if we come into app controllers and the profile controller, we have this show action. That's where it's taking us, which will then show us this views profile show page, just in case you're not familiar with how the routing works. So once we have that, we can then do two different methods. One's going to be a post for the follow button, and the other one's going to be a delete request for the unfollow. So the way that these work is we're going to come into the profile controller, we'll create a follow and an unfollow action, and then we're just doing a post request if we're creating a follower, and then we're going to create a delete request if we're unfollowing that person. And that'll handle updating both the followers and the followees. Speaking of which, we now need to go into the model and the user.rb because we need to actually update the followers and the followees. We're also going to have to come into the relationship.rb because we still need to set up the belongs to for this. So in the relationship.rb, we're going to actually say this belongs to a follower with a class name of user, which of course matches up with our user.rb model over here. And then you already guessed it, for the followee, it's the same thing, just with the word followee instead. We can save this, and at this point, we're actually done with the relationship model, so we can go ahead and close that. And then we can come over to the user model, where we have to do a little bit more, but it's pretty self-explanatory. And by that, I mean it's not at all self-explanatory, so I'm going to have to explain it, which is why I do these videos. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by saying a user has many followed users. This is going to have a foreign key reference for the follower ID. So our users followed users are going to be the followers in the relationship model. We then say it has a class name of relationship, which is self-explanatory. And then dependent destroy just means when we delete a followed user, we want to delete the corresponding relationship. Once that's done, we then want to actually establish what our followees are, because what I want to do is say current underscore user dot followees to get a counter for the number of people the user is following. So in that case, we're actually going to say that we has many followees through the followed users, which are dependent destroy. So you can see the way this works is we has many followees, which is the thing we want to call it. We say it's through the followed users, which is actually what we create up here. So without this line right here, this is going to throw problems. And then we just say dependent destroy because I don't know what I'm doing. So I just throw dependent destroy at the end of everything if I want it to be deleted when I'm done with it. Once we have that, we can then do pretty much the same thing for the users that are following this user, or I guess I should say for the followers. So if we come down here, we say it has many following users, which are just the people following this user, through the relationship with the followee ID and dependent destroy. And then we once again say this user has many followers through the following users, which is dependent destroy. So this right here handles our the people that we're following, and this right here handles the people that are following us. Once that's done, we are now good to go in. We could go to our home page, or we could go into the controller. I think we should probably start with the home page just so we can get something very basic set up so that we can actually play around with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by doing a check if we're the current user, which is just a way to check if we're signed in. If we are signed in, we're just going to show the current user's email. We can then add a link if you'd like to, and I'm going to get rid of this class because I'm copying and pasting this off of another project that did have Bootstrap. So we'll just create a link to edit the account if we want to do that. Otherwise, what we'll do is create a link to the logout button. And the reason why this one's a button is because if this is a link, it's not going to work. You need the logout button specifically to be a button to rather than a link to with a method of delete. I think there's also a turbo method you can add to this that allows it to work with the link to maybe, but I think the button to is the preferred approach now, which is a little bit annoying if you're trying to actually style your button. So that is something to look out for. I do think you can do like a link to and wrap it around a button maybe, but this is just the way that I've been doing it. And then we need exactly what GitHub Copilot's suggesting here. We need a link to the login page, which is the new user session path, and then a link to the sign up page, which is the new user registration path. And that's all fairly standard Devise stuff. Once that's done, we actually kind of done with the home page. We're just going to be manually navigating to the actual pages for the user profiles because that's not really the point of the tutorial. But if we do this now, we can come in here and we can log in or sign up. I'm going to click sign up and I'll say dean@example.com with a password of password. And then if I click sign up, it's actually not going to redirect me. I don't know why. So let's see if that worked. Let's do dean@example.com with a password of password. Doesn't look like that's working. So let's try this again. I hit Control-Shift-F to force a refresh. Okay, that time it worked. Let me just verify that this is actually working. Maybe something was cached weird. So I'm going to say john@doe.com with a password of password. Hit enter here just to move everything down. I'm going to click sign up. Okay, it looks like it's working now, so that was just a weird little bug. But we now have 2 accounts. I'm actually going to create one more. I'm going to say this one will be jane@doe.com with a password of password. And then I'm going to log out of Jane, and I'm going to log into dean@example.com with a password of password again. That way we just have a couple pages we can navigate to. Now, if we come up here to the nav bar, we can type /p/1 to go to, I guess, Dean's profile page. We can go to /p/2 to go to John's profile page, or /3 to go to Jane's profile page. But of course, we can't tell whose page we're on because there's absolutely nothing here telling us that. So what we can do instead is come into here and say for the profile show page, what we want to do is we'll just render a page for the actual user profile. So I'm going to create a main tag here. I'm going to close the main tag. And then I'm just going to say this has a render for the profile/user, which is going to take us to a place that has a user of @user. Now, this, of course, means we have to create this user profile partial, and we have to assign this @user in the pages controller, or no, the profile controller, because this is on the this is in the profile controller. So let's start by creating the partial, just so that you can see what the error is if the user doesn't exist. We'll say, let's create a new file, underscore, and we call this user.html.erb. And then in the user.html.erb, we can just throw a h1 with the user email. And then we have some other logic that we don't really need to worry about right now. I'm just going to leave it like this and refresh, because then we'll get an undefined method email for nil class. The reason we're getting this is because the user here, let me actually get rid of this the user here doesn't exist yet, because in the show page, we're trying to pass in a user. And if I type user right here, you can see that that just returns nil, because we haven't actually told the application what user is yet, or what @user is. So we have to come up to the controllers, the profile controller, and then in the show action, we need to set the user. Or we can come down here, create a private section, say def set user, just like GitHub Copilot is suggesting. And then we just want to say @user is equal to user.find by params ID. And then we can come up to the top here and we can say before action set user, which will just set the user for the show page. And that's going to work because we're passing the ID parameter up here in the nav bar whenever we visit somewhere. So now if I go to p/3, it takes us to Jane's profile, 2 should take us to John, and then 1 should take us to Dean. So that seems to be working just fine. So the next thing we can do is in the profile show, or in the profile partial below the user email, we can render something that shows us how many people are following a user. To do this, we can just do another render for a partial. So we'll just say render the profile follower count. I'm just going to put a BR tag here just to break things up a bit. So this will be a partial that shows us how many followers a user has. We can then do a regular div, which will have some additional styling that I need to get rid of. But this one's just going to be how many people this user is following. And below that, we can do a check to see if a user is logged in. You'll see why in a second here. So this is a check to see if the user on this page is the current user. If the user on this page is the current user, we can then just show a link to the edit profile button. So this is similar to how Instagram works. If I open up my Instagram profile real quick, instagram.com/deaniocom. So the way that Instagram works is when you're on the page, if you're the like the person, the same user account as the page you're viewing, you have an edit profile option. But if I search for, like, I don't know, Jarvis, I go to his page, we don't have a edit profile button, obviously, because I'm not Jarvis, but we do have a follow button instead, and then I can then follow the user. So that's sort of what we're going to be doing here. So if we are the current user, then we just want to show an edit button, and then we'll say else if we are logged in, because again, we can be on this page and not be logged in which case we don't want to see anything. But if we're on this page and we're logged in, but we're not the current, or we're not the user that this page belongs to, we're then going to render a partial, and we can just go ahead and simplify this. We're going to render a partial, which is going to be for the profile follow button, which will, and we can also simplify this, just have a user of @user. So let's just do this because it's a little bit easier for people to follow. So this is very similar to the profile render up here. And we actually don't even need this partial either. So we can just simplify it even more. So let's get rid of that too. What this allows us to do if we refresh is probably get an error because we haven't created these partials yet. So the first one we have to do is the follower count. So let's come down to profile, right click, new file. And then we'll say this is for the _follower_count.html.erb. And the follower count is actually pretty simple. The only thing we're going to put in here for right now is the user.followers.count, and we're going to pluralize it, which just means that if we have 0 followers, it'll put an S at the end. If we have 1 follower, it won't put an S. And if we have 2 or more, it'll also put an S at the end. So just make sure you leave this as singular and wrap it in the pluralized tag. Once that's done, we can refresh, and you can now see that Dean has 0 followers. He has 0 people following him. But if I go to not my profile page, so let's say I go to profile 2, you'll see that we have a missing partial for the follow button. The reason for that is in the user partial, if we are not the same user, we then have this other partial that we're rendering, which is what just happened, which is why it's throwing the error. So we do need to create a follow button. So we'll click new file. And then in here, we'll say this is the _follow_button.html.erb. And in the follow button, we need to just check if the user is, or if we're following this user. So we're going to say if following @user, except we can just leave it as user. Then we need to do some logic. And GitHub Copilot apparently has its own ideas for what we're going to do there. But this is the actual snippet of code that we're going to use. So we're going to say if we are following this user, which is a helper method we have to create, then we want to unfollow this user by going to the profile unfollow path with an ID of the user.id, a method of delete, and this class doesn't matter because we don't have Bootstrap in this application. Else, we are not following this user yet, which of course means that we need to follow this user. So then we'll say this is a button to follow the user, which takes us to the profile follow path with an ID of user ID and a method of post. We can then come down here, say end, and this will all work 100% of the time, except we don't have a following helper. So this is just a small little helper method that I made, and I threw it into the user helper just to sort of show how helpers work. So if we come into the helpers, we should have a profile helper right here. And in the profile helper, which gets created because we called the controller the profile controller. So if you called yours the user controller, this will be the user helper. In here, what we need to do is say that we have a include for the action view record identifier. And then we need to do a def to check if we're following this user. So we just say def following ? We pass in a user as a parameter. And then we just say, is the current user's followees including the user? So the current user is you. It checks, are you following, or does your list of users that you follow include this user? And then it just returns true or false. So include is a included helper method, no pun intended. And then we're just adding the ands here because we have to check, return unless current _user, and then you got to check to make sure that the followees also exists. So it's just doing your checks to make sure that you're signed in and that you do have followees. Otherwise, you'll get some errors. Now, the other thing we're going to add in here while we're in here, because there's really not a lot else to add, is this DOM ID for follower, which takes in a follower and just returns a DOM ID. And all this it does is if I pass in DOM _ID _for _follower, and I call it with I don't know, let's say John, he's user 2. All it's going to do is just return me the string user _2. So it just does that, which is what we're going to be using for some turbo logic. So this is just a small little helper that I don't even know if I use in this. Probably not. But okay, so we have this. We can now come back here, refresh the page, And the profile helper gets included here because this is the profile page. If you're on, let's say, the home page and you're trying to add a follow button, you might run into issues with the profile helper if you're trying to use it in the controllers, especially because the controllers, you have to explicitly include this helper, which we'll cover in a minute here. But for right now, if I click follow, actually, let me move down the console. If I click follow and I scroll all the way up, it's going to tell me that the action follow could not be found for the profile controller. If we open up the profile controller, you can see that the only action in here is the show action. So we actually have to create the logic for following and unfollowing a user. So we'll say def follow end, and then we'll come down here and say def unfollow end. So if we want to follow a user, we want to say relationship.create _or _find _by. So we're going to try to find a relationship where the follower ID is the current _user.id. And then we're going to set the followee _ID to be the @user.id. And again, we can use current user because we're signed in, and we can use the @user.id because we set the user down here. Okay, so we have this relationship being created. We now need to undo this relationship if we try to unfollow the user. So to unfollow a user, we're going to grab the current user because, again, we're doing all this from the perspective of you, the person who just clicked the follow or the unfollow button. We're then going to check your followed users. .where, and again, we can use this check for the followed users because of how we set up the user model, because we have the followed user list right here. We also have the list of followees, but of course you don't want to delete your followees. You want to delete the followed users instead, which will update your followees. But we do the current user.followed users.where so that we can check for the follower ID and the followee ID, which is actually this snippet right here. So we can check, is the follower ID the current user.id, and is the followee ID the @user.id? And if we get any results, we just want to destroy them all. So we're going to indiscriminately destroy all of those followed users so that the current user no longer follows this @user person. So we come over here and refresh and click follow, and I scroll down here. You'll see this green text means that we inserted into the follower relationship this information. So if I come in here and I refresh now, you can see we have one follower for John at Doe, which is of course Dean, and we have the unfollow text now. So if I come over here and I open up another tab and I change this to the page 1, you can see that Dean is now following one user. If I come over here and I go to profile 3, I click follow, and then I refresh this page, you'll see that the one follower gets updated and Dean's profile now shows him following two users. So this is nice and all, but I don't like having to refresh the page. Not great user experience, but it is slightly more work to set up properly. So to get this working, there's a couple different components. Now, if you want everyone to receive the update, you then need to come into the user.rb and say like after create commit broadcast a TurboStream update. But of course, if you have, I don't know, PewDiePie on your application or Mr. Beast or whoever, Elon Musk, they're going to be getting followers up the wazoo. And if you have a person on that page and they get like an update every single time Elon Musk gets a follower, your application is going to slow to a crawl. So what I like to do is only update it when I click on the follow or the unfollow button, and I only update it for myself. And then for anyone else, it'll only update when they refresh the page, just to sort of slow down the number of updates that get pushed through. And the way that we can do this is we don't have to do any updates in the user. Instead, we just have to do updates in the controller. So in the profile controller, we're actually going to come below the relationship and we're going to do a respond to do for the format. We can do an end right here. And then we're going to call format.turbo_stream do end. And then in here, we need to render a turbo stream. And this is where it's going to get a little bit complicated because we actually need to update two different locations. So we're updating the follower text on the button, and we're updating the actual counter here. So that is something to keep note of. And we actually don't need to update the following text because we'll never be on a page where we follow the person and then we have to update their following count, because that's our following count and we can't click follow on ourselves. So this text never needs to be updated, but this text does and this button does. So we actually need to do a render where we replace an array of stuff. And don't tell anyone that I told you how to do this, because it's sort of frowned upon to do all of this logic in the controller. But you can only cover so much in these tutorials. So we're going to do a turbostream.replace for the text for the button, because we need to change like what the button does too, because it's going to take us to the actual follower, or the actual follow versus the unfollow logic. And then we need to do a turbostream.update for the follower count. So this right here will be the follower count. And then we'll come back over here and we'll just do the follow button logic. So for this, we can do a DOM ID for follower. So I guess we are actually using that helper from earlier. And then we just want to pass in the @user. And all this is going to do, if I grab this, I can make a comment real quick. This gets converted to, I don't know, let's say this is for John Doe who has an ID of 2. It'll just be like user_2. So let's say you have John Doe with a user ID of 2. He then gets converted into user2. So we want to do a replace for the div with an ID of user2, or the turbo frame with an ID of user2. We then need to tell it which partial we're going to be updating. So here we're going to say this is for the partial, and it's going to be for the profile/follow button, which is why we put this into its own partial down here. If I come down here to profile, that's why this is in the follow button partial instead of just all being on the same page. Sure, it's cleaner, but you know me in tutorials, I'm usually pretty lazy. So that's probably not the entire reason why we did it. And then we need to say this has some locals, which is just going to be the user, which is going to be the @user. And the reason why we're doing that is because on the user partial, when we have the follow button, we have to pass in a user. So in the controller, we also have to pass in this user, which will then come into the partial for the follow button and check if we're following this user. Now, we don't do a like current_user.following user check, because with Turbo, if you try to use current user inside of a partial that you're using Turbo updates for, it'll blow a gasket because you can't reference the user in here because you don't have the global state or whatever. So instead, we just pass it off to a partial and let the partial deal with our headaches. So that all goes into the profile helper here, which handles the current user check. Now, we don't actually have access to it here. So what we can do is we can come up to the top and we can just say we need to include the profile helper, because we can use it in our views, but we have to explicitly include it in our controller. And well, I mean, I guess what I can do is I can actually just take this and comment this out for right now so you can see the error just in case you ever run into it. But once we have this done, we can then throw our parentheses right here, and then we can do our next turbo stream. So this is our first one right here. And then we can do our next one, which needs to be for the follower count. Now, this one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to actually just grab the, we're going to say @user.id, and we're just going to do -follower-count. So we're going to handcraft this ID that we're going to be replacing, and we'll add these into our actual views in a minute here. But once that's done, we can then grab the partial and the locals again. So we'll just come down here, paste in the partial and the locals, and then we'll get rid of that comma. And now if I hit Control S, hopefully it'll be happy with me. And it looks like it is. So this logic right here is essentially what we need to do in the unfollow button. So you could probably abstract this out to like a helper method if you wanted to, because it's both the exact same logic. But we have this in the follow and the unfollow button, and we're probably going to get some errors saying that the methods are too long because RuboCop's not happy with me. Once we have that, we can then come over here. We'll refresh the page. We'll click unfollow, and we'll run into the undefined method for the DOM ID for helper. And that's just because we don't have the helper included yet. So if we include the helper, we come back here, we click follow. It'll now do the same thing as before, but we still have to refresh the page. And the reason is we have this update and this replace, but we're not telling it where these things are. So it knows it needs to go out and find the like user _2 or the user or the 2-follower-count, but these don't exist in our views yet. So it doesn't error out, but it also doesn't do anything. So to actually make it do something, we need to wrap our partials in whatever we called the thing in our controller. So in our controller, the first one has a user ID of 2. So we just said user _2. So in our follow button, we need to wrap this entire thing in a turbo _frame _tag for the DOM _ID for the @user. And we could, of course, also use our helper method here if I had more than 2 brain cells, but we're going to just do it this way. So this will do the same thing as our helper method. We're just going to grab the DOM ID of the @user. We wrap it in a do block, and then this entire turbo frame tag just goes around all of this. And then this is what's going to get replaced. Once that's done, we can then come out here, refresh the page, click follow, click unfollow, and you'll see the button gets updated, but our text doesn't. So if I refresh the page, the text gets updated. If I refresh it again, it gets updated. But we need to actually update this text. So the button's working, but the text isn't. So if we come into the follower count, and I'm actually going to do a bit of a chess pro move here. If we come into our profile controller, if you'd like to pause the video and try and find the proper way to implement this yourself, feel free to do so, and then I'll show you how to do it. But basically, we have to take this little snippet right here, or we can actually grab the entire string. We then come into the follower count partial, and then we just wrap this whole thing in another turbo frame tag. So we open up some Ruby code, say turbo _frame _tag. We paste in the tag that we want. We put a do at the end of it, and then we put an end at the end of the do, which is super confusing, but it's just what we got to do. And then we can tab this all over, make sure it looks pretty, hit F11, come over here and refresh. Now we can click follow, and we seem to be replacing this with the actual partial. So we have to come into the profile controller, and this is why you don't copy paste your code. So this right here needs to actually be for the follower _count partial, not for the follow button partial. So the first one's for the button, the second one's for the count. If we come in here and refresh, we can then click follow and unfollow, and you can see that counter getting updated. And now if I open up another page, so this is for Jane Doe. So I'll log into john@doe.com with a password of password. And then I'll come over to P/3. If I come in here and I click follow on Jane's account, you'll see that the follower account or the follower counter updates for John, but it doesn't update for Dean until Dean refreshes the page. So there's not millions of hits going out to everyone's page because that can obviously cause some issues. But okay, so that is our real-time follower system that's updating and allowing us to grab all of the followers as needed. You can then, of course, do similar logic to how we grab the follower users to see like which users you want to display on a page, right? So if we come back to the home page real quick, I'll try and do some ad hoc coding real quick. So let's come over to pages and the home page. And then on the home page below everything else, maybe we'll just say if, well, we already have the current user check right here, right? So if the user's logged in, then below the email, let's just do a current _user dot followed _users dot each do u and then let's do a u.email with a br. And then we'll come over here and we'll refresh the page. And this is for our relationship. So we don't have a list of followed users. We have a list of followees and followers, right? So if we want to actually grab the user itself and not the relationship, we then need to say the current user dot followees. And you can see here that, well, I guess I have to do a BR tag here. Actually, let's do a HR just so it's a bit more clear. You can see that Dean is currently following John and Jane. And if I check who Dean is being followed by, so maybe I'll do this. I'll say this is for the followers, or this is for the people Dean or people I'm following. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. And then we can come down here and we can say people following me. Close this. We'll just copy this little loop, which I'll put like right here. We'll copy this. We'll come down here. Oops. Okay. Well, this is just a disaster, isn't it? This is why you don't improvise your code while you're doing these tutorials. So we come down here and then we say for the people that are following me, let's check through each of the current users' followers. We'll refresh the page and you'll see that nobody is following me. Now, if I come over to John, or I can even log in as Jane. So let's do login, jane@doe.com with a password of password. You can see that Jane isn't following anyone, but Jane has both me and John following her. If I go over to /p/3, which is Jane's profile page, you can see that I am in fact following her. If I click unfollow and she refreshes the page, now it's just John following her. If I follow her again, you can see now I'm listed on the list again. So this is just a really quick way for you to, I guess in like 30 or 40 minutes, it's not that quick, but it's a way for you to get a follower and a followee list or a following list implemented into your Rails app that updates for the users that it needs to, right? Because Jane doesn't need this to update all the time. If she did, there's tutorials that cover that, but for this implementation, it makes more sense for me to not have that update all the time. But yeah, that's going to do it for this tutorial. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.